Hello world, as we would say, or hello world, handwritten on matrix printer paper by Brian Cunningham, the person who wrote the original Hello World code in 1978. It's also signed down in the corner, and this was a piece of art that went on auction in the first ever auction of computer algorithms back, well, around 10 years ago. If you had $8,500 to spare, this could be yours to own. The original artifact, a bit of computer history, and a great artwork, so to speak. So welcome to this intimate session, the most intimate session of all at NDC London, about art created with code throughout history. And it's a story that starts end of the 50s, early 1960s in the United States of America. So this here is Michael Noll. Michael Noll was an engineer who worked at Bell Laboratories. Now, Bell Laboratories is, or was, a telephone company. And he was a researcher there, but during his evenings at work, he started experimenting with the computers he had. And he was playing around just trying to figure out how he could use this creatively. And in some of his work, he was doing audio analysis. So working on an IBM mainframe computer, it looks like this, he had a mishap.
Not too well. We're still having trouble with F-drive in regard to density changing on the 1401.
I'd say, well, we'll put it on the 7090 then and use it for an output tape.
Yeah, that should cool it if you play it that way.
Yeah, no sweat. Okay, anything else?
Yeah, I'm glad I thought of it. I had it logged. You'll notice that when you come up on Valgol and where the compiler has a beautiful bug in it, in case we get clobbered completely, you hit IC3 and give it a trot of 50, and that'll kick the job off, and that's all you have to do.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
So the compiler had a beautiful bug in it, and what you do in the early 1960s when you come across a bug, you write a memo. This is the 1960s take on what is now known as an email, but he wrote a proper memo of this. This is the code in question. It's all written in Fortran. And this is the Fortran code that was used to produce what was known as pattern 2. This is pattern 2. It was supposed to look like something entirely different, so this was a mishap that happened. But Michael Noll took this around to his colleagues at Bell Labs and showed it to him. And Evelyn Burkemp, one of his co-workers, she said that, you know what, Michael, this here is computer art. And from then on, we had the term computer art, and that's where it all started, supposedly, if it hadn't been for Britain and Desmond Paul Henry, who was a British artist who had collected the northern bomb sites that were used by Allied forces during the Second World War in the bomber planes. And he started modifying these bomb site computers into becoming drawing machines. Now, you might say, that does not look like a computer to me, but that's just because it's an entirely different computer for what you're used to using. This is a mechanical analog computer, and you would enter different variables into it, and it would behave differently based on that. And he modified this to draw these wonderful spiral patterns on paper. And he did this a couple of months before Michael Noll stumbled upon computer art over in the United States of America. So computer art was invented here in England. Here are some of the works that he created. There are loads of these. None of them have a title, but they're still quite beautiful to look at. But we have to get back to the United States and what was happening in Bell Laboratories, because Michael Noll was really on a mission. And here we have two works. One of them is a composition with lines by Pierre Mondrian. That's the one on the right-hand side. It was made in 1917. And this was at the very beginning of the neoplasticism period that Pierre Mondrian is known for. You have probably seen his paintings with the big blocks of color and the lines in between. This is where all that started. And the other one is by Michael Noll, and it's called For Pierre Mondrian, and it's a work that he has programmed in Fortran that tries to imitate the style of Mondrian. And Michael Noll took this around to his colleagues again and asked them, which one do you find the most beautiful? So I can address that same question to you. Point in the direction of the one that you find the most beautiful of these two. You're a very mixed crowd, I have to say, and that's a good thing, because the experience and experiencing art is a very personal thing, and we should get to know that during this presentation. So again, two other works. One of them is by Paul Klee. It's called High Roads and By Roads. Paul Klee was part of the Bauhaus movement, which had a very special and philosophy towards design, architecture, and art in particular. And the other one is by German artist Frieda Nacke, and it's called Hommage à Paul Klee. You can obviously tell which one of these two was made by a computer in the 1960s. It's the one on the right-hand side. The other one is the Paul Klee work. And Paul Klee said that when he created his works, he walked the lines across the canvas and then filled his feelings in between the areas that appeared. And Frieda Nacke did the same thing with a plotter that moved across the sheet of paper from left to right, making the lines horizontally first, and then just filling in the blanks with different geometrical figures, such as the circles and the lines and so forth, with quite a bit of randomness to it. So he couldn't see beforehand what this would look like, and there are quite a few of these made. Things weren't only happening in this looks entirely different behind me than in front of me. Things were not only happening in the States. Back in Europe, the French artist Michael Moore, which we are seeing here, he was a classically trained painter, but in the early 70s, he taught himself programming and opened up one of the first, or I think the first ever, solo exhibition of artworks created by a computer. This one is one of the works featured there. It's program 26, also known as quark lines. And in the same way as Frieda Nacke walked the lines across the sheet of paper, he, on random, found between 12 and 25 points and started drawing lines of those that changed a bit, 32 lines down, then made a little break, which is a white space in between, and then just kept on repeating the process. This is one of the works. This is another one. It's one called Pour Pierre Baudot. Now, Pierre Baudot is this guy. He was a French composer who was one of the pioneers within using computers to compose music. Some of you might have heard another talk by me about computers performing and composing music. So I won't play his music now, but as you can see, this might look like musical notation. Again, this is an example of generative writing, where there is a randomness into how the lines are generated, but it looks like some sort of writing again, and it's all algorithmically generated.
J'ai donc mis dans ma petite tête que je vais essayer de faire de l'art visuel à l'ordinateur. Aujourd'hui, c'est vide, mais un premier essai qui ne marchait pas du tout, c'était grâce à Pierre Barbeau. Mais M. Hunt était quand même, et c'était en 68, où tout était possible, on pouvait tout dire, tout penser, tout rêver, tout. Mais j'ai pris mon courage entre mes deux mains, j'ai frappé à la porte du directeur du centre de calcul et je lui ai dit que, bonjour monsieur, j'aimerais essayer de faire de l'art visuel sur ordinateur. Écoute, le gars qui m'a jeté un coup d'œil, je ne peux pas te dire, il avait peur que je vais tomber dingue et qu'il faut faire venir une infirmière, vite, ou... Enfin, art visuel, oui. Il a dit oui. Il a dit oui.
He said yes. So this is Vera Molnár. She was 98 years old when this interview was done. And she was also very inspired by Pierre Bardot. And she was also inspired by Paul Klee. So this is a work of hers called Rechercher à Paul Klee, or Searching for Paul Klee, which is one of the works that she made with this computer she got to spend some time with. And Vera Molnár changed things. She had a very different approach to the men who came before her. Most of the men were mathematicians or engineers. Vera Molnár was a trained artist, and she had a different approach to this. So instead of trying to imitate the works of known artists as the men who had come before her had done, she sort of deconstructed the original artworks and reconstructed them using the computer. So this one is really just a repetition of different squares made up of various lines, but we can still see some of the elements of that Paul Klee work we saw earlier. These are some even earlier works of hers, and very mathematical in the process, how she made these. We have the lines going across, and they are rotating. Each of them has its own square to be in. But then she does something very different, and she takes away, on random, areas of the lines, which brings a bit of humanity into this. So it's not as static and sterile as the other works. This has some element of humanity to it. And having that lo-fi feeling is one of the things that might make computer-generated art interesting. So this one is one of the first moving works that were made. This is called Poem Field Number 2. It's by an artist called Stan van der Beek, with a very, very strange jazz soundtrack in the background. This thing also stems out of Bell Laboratories, even if Stan van der Beek was not working there. But in the early 1960s, the US government asked Bell Laboratories to create an animated film about what happens at ground zero during a nuclear detonation. And to do that, they created a piece of software known as Bellflex, which was a special language to program bitmap graphics that would then be printed onto celluloid film to create an animation. And Stan van Beek used that programming language to create this one, where he presents a poem printed onto celluloid film and set to this music. And having this on film and animated the way it does gives it that really fussy, lo-fi vibe that makes it sort of satisfying to look at least in my opinion. So again, a very interesting example of how people repurpose some technology just to be creative with it. Going back to England, this is a work by Harold Cohen. Now, Harold Cohen was a classically trained painter. He had represented Britain in the Venice Biennale as a painter, but in the late 1960s, he got a scholarship to go to Stanford University's Artificial Intelligence Lab. And while being there, he got interested in computer programming and started working on a project that would follow him for the rest of his life, known as Aaron. Now, Aaron was the first ever artificial intelligence to create art. And this is one of the first artworks that Aaron ever made. This is from 1978, and it's from a series of works known as the Amsterdam Suite. It was first put on display in Amsterdam, hence the name. In 1978, Aaron was only capable of drawing black and white pen drawings, but it was not instructed in any way in what they would look like. It had some basic knowledge programmed into its code about different shapes. All of the other decisions were made by the computer of its own. And then it was hand-coded by Cohen. And here we see Aaron actually drawing things. But as Aaron developed 10 years later, towards the end of the 1980s, it had become way better at making art. And this is an example of where it's sort of broke through as a proper artist. At this point, Aaron worked in the same way. It knew how to draw things like faces, how to draw the foliage on plants and so forth. And it had a process where it drew the foreground elements first and then filled in the background. But it also had learned by this time how to work with color and color in the drawings that it had made. And it has this really nice play on chromatics between the background foliage that we see and the foreground as well, that to me resembles Paul Cézanne's famous painting, The Bathers, that was made 100 years before this. So for those of you who have seen my talk on computer music, might know that I have a special place in my heart for Brian Eno. But Brian Eno is not only a musician, he's also a visual artist, and this is a work of his known as 10 million paintings. 77 million paintings is the correct number, that he created in 2007. So all of this is generated real time by elements drawn by Eno himself and recomposed into an infinite amount of different visual expressions. Now, the name 77 million paintings is not chosen at random. 77 million paintings is the amount of paintings you could hope to see in a lifetime, from the time or age where you become aware of art and you spend 8 hours a day looking at a new one every 10 seconds. So this was shown in gallery spaces, but it was also available to buy as a DVD. There was not 77 million on that DVD, but you could also have this as a screensaver for your computer. And it's one of those examples of how projected images in a gallery space is one of the best ways to show computer art out in the world. And this is another example of that. This is a work by Corey Archangel, who is an artist who has worked in many different medias. And this one is called Super Mario Clouds. It's from 2001, and this is typically how you would have this presented. It's the clouds from Super Mario projected on the wall or seen on a CRT screen. So what is this thing? Well, it's this. It's a modified version of the original 1985 Super Mario Brothers game, where all of the elements, except from the blue sky and the clouds, are taken away. And it sort of becomes an early digital age take on the Romantic period, where you would have dramatic cloudscapes and seascapes painted in meticulous detail in the best pixelated graphics we could get in 1985. But it's also a very good example of how talented Corey Archangel actually is. Because to go in and modify a game cartridge to create something like this, while still being a painter, a musician, and doing all sorts of other things, is something that takes a whole lot of talent. So this thing here is what the web could look like back in 1993 when the first websites came about. This is a website known as Jody.com. It was created by a Dutch artist duo known as Joan Hemskirk and Dirk Pasmans. And it's a website where you can click around into an endless maze of really strange user interfaces. And this is one of the things that this duo has worked with, is that they have done many works on human-computer interaction. And this was a study into that. And there were quite a few websites during the early and mid-90s who did that. This is another one by Benjamin from 1997 called superbad.com. Again, it's a seemingly random navigation through the sitemap from hell, to be honest. But it starts out with something that looks like a proper corporate web page, but you know that there's something odd when it says on top in a banner that we ran out of ad space. But there's even more to these websites, because back in the 1990s, when you were learning how to create websites of your own, what you usually would do is that you would put your mouse up, right-click, and choose View Source to see the source code, the HTML source code for the web page itself. And hidden underneath the surface, you would have all sorts of illicit things like the Anarchist Cookbook, which had instructions for how to make bombs. There was schematics for making a nuclear reactor as such. So all of the naughty bits hidden underneath the surface in there. Interesting. Now, this might seem really odd now, but at the time, mid-90s, as much as 10% of all websites were experiments like these, which might sound strange. Now, there is some graphical video game violence coming up, so if you don't want to see that, please look away for a moment, because this is a work by Joseph Delap from 2017, and it's known as Elegy. So this started playing as a Twitch stream at midnight, July 4th, 2017. And it is a highly modified version of the game Grand Theft Auto 5. And what happens in here is that every single day it starts playing the game on its own. And in the gameplay during that day, the number of people who have been killed in gun homicides in the United States that year up until that date is killed in the game as well. All the while America the Beautiful is playing in the background, exactly 100 years after Irving Berlin wrote the song. And when it got to New Year's Eve that year, the counter ended on 14,730 killings within the game. If it had been allowed to play all the way to New Year's Eve the year after, that would go up to over 15,000. And the interesting thing here is that Grand Theft Auto is a game that has received loads of criticism about the amount of violence in the game. And what Joseph Delap does with this work is that he uses that game to critique the US society for the amount of gun violence that is actually there in the real world, which I think is a genius way to turn things around and turn the tables on things. Staying with the United States and the United States government, this is an interesting work by a anarchist hacker group known as the Radical Software Group. And it's a work from the early noughties, and it's called Carnivore. It takes its name from a project that the FBI launched just after the 9/11 attacks on United States, where they introduced a piece of software called Carnivore to monitor online traffic. So that software would read your emails, trying to figure out whether you're a terrorist or not. So what Radical Software Group did with their Carnivore work was that they presented it in a gallery space, just running on a computer with a network that you could connect to as well, and it was snooping on network traffic. So while it was running, it would show the private communication going on online on the screen, which was a very early comment on all of the surveillance that we know is happening now with all of the surveillance capitalism and that which is all over the web. And that was one of the examples of how computer code itself can be turned into artworks. This is another piece known as biennial.py. Yes, it's an annotated printout of Python source code, and it's from 2001. It's by Eva and Mattis Frankos, which is an artist couple. So even you in the front seats might find this a bit difficult to read and make out what this actually is. It's Python source code, and it's source code for a virus. And the way this would be displayed in the gallery space is that you would have two pedestals with a computer on top infecting each other with this virus over and over again. But that's not really the most interesting thing about this. It's the naming conventions that are used in the source code. Because the source code here uses the language of sexual reproduction about how the virus propagates. And there are also things about when it tries to find its subjects to infect, it uses the language of socialization. So it meets other entities, it has a chat with them, and if it pulls, it infects it. So, so this is a very interesting example of how the computer source code itself can be a work of art. This is another example of that. We are going to Japan 2010, and a work by Yusuke Endo, and it's a piece of Ruby source code called Clobe. This is the actual source code itself. So this is something known as a Cohen, which is a program that outputs its own source code. But if you run it over and over again, it will change a bit. So the globe that is in the middle of the source code will rotate by a few degrees every time you run this and then print out its own source code. If you run that again, it goes on and on and on forever and ever. This takes mastery of the Ruby programming language to be able to pull something like this off. But it also takes a lot of creativity to say that today I'm going to sit down, spend 10 hours writing a Ruby script that prints out its own source code with a globe in the middle rotating every time it does that. So comparing these two works, the Python virus is very much about self-replicating computer programs moving out into the world, which is very much in line with some of the things that people were starting to worry about at the time, about things like nanobots devouring the entire world. While this one, being Japanese, is a much more introspective work, which the source code is all about itself and what happens inside it. And I find that interesting. So, can't do without dancing apes during the NDC conference party. And yes, we are going to talk about the Boring Ape Club. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is probably one of the best known examples of non-fungible tokens, which are crypto things that you can buy and have some sort of proof of ownership that it's on the Ethereum blockchain. None of that interests me at all, but what I find interesting is how these things are actually made and what they resemble. Because when I look at these apes, I see a modern-day take on the industrial art creation process that was pioneered by Andy Warhol in the 1960s when he more or less invented pop art. All of these apes are created from a set of rules and combined together by pieces that the artists behind these created, and there are like 10,000 of these in total. But not only that, because I also see something that comes from this. This is a ballet choreographed by a choreographer called Lucinda Childs, and it's simply just called Dance. But what's special about this is that the dancers do not dance to music. They are just dancing to instructions of how to piece together the elementary moves of ballet and count. And this is something that stems from an artist called Sol LeWitt. He is known for his wall paintings, which you are seeing being made here. What Sol LeWitt did is that he never painted any of these himself. He would sit down and write the instructions for how to create his artworks. So he would separate the entire idea behind the artwork from the creation of the artwork itself. To just give you an example, the source code for wall drawing 280 on a wall surface or any continuous stretch of wall using a hard pencil, place 50 points at random. The points should be evenly distributed over the area of the wall, then make all the possible straight lines connecting pairs of points. And that's it. And it's up to the craftsman to actually go out and make the work. Such a thing like compiling art. But it's interesting. It sort of makes a very clear cut between the concept and the work itself. These are obviously tulip bulbs. And it's a work from 2019 by Anna Riddler, and it's called the Mosaic Virus. Anna Riddler, by hand, took something like 10,000 photos of tulip bulbs and annotated them and used them to train a generative AI model that would create these tulips, which is all well and good. But there is a reason for her using tulips as her subject. Because in the 17th century, there was an economical bubble known as the Dutch tulip mania. Anyone heard of that? It's known to be one of the first ever sort of speculative bubbles to ever burst. And believe it or not, during that time, a single rare tulip bulb could cost as much as a house. And the thing Anna Riddler is doing here, if you look at these, you can see sort of some small twitchy movements in the tulip bubbles. And those movements are correlated to the real-time price in dollars for Bitcoin. So the fluctuations in the Bitcoin price are represented in these tulips, and it's obviously Anna Riddler commenting on the massive hype and the economical bubble that cryptocurrencies are. Staying with flowers, this is also an interesting thing that uses flowers, at least at the beginning. It's by Oliana Lialia, and it's called A Comparative History of Classic Animated GIFs and Glitter Graphics. It's from 2007, and it's displayed in the gallery space like this. It's just a load of screens stacked on top of each other, and then it shows these GIFs just juxtaposed beside each other. You can actually go on the web and see the whole thing there. So these things she is showing here are bookends to a period in web history. So the animated GIFs are from the beginning of the Web 1.0 era, and the glitter graphics are from the end of that period. Because in 2007, the concept of social media was just starting to take off. But that also marked the end of a period where loads of people were using their own creativity to make their own personal websites. And that was coming to an end. So this work is more or less a lament to a bygone time that ended when social media took over. And it's a nice way to pay homage to websites like we saw earlier. This here is Portrait of Edmund Bellamy. Anyone seen this one before? So this might be one of the most famous AI works ever. It was created by a French collective known as Obvious, but it's signed with this. This is the formula for an adversarial generative network, which is what is used to create visual art using AI. And the portrait has a lineage going back into time with many generations of classical portraits that it was trained on. The reason why this work is so well known is that this is one of the first AI-generated works ever to be sold on auction. It went on auction in 2018 at Christie's. It had an expected going price of somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000. When the bidding closed, the price was over $450,000 for this portrait, which inspired some people. So this was done by a German artist later that year, and it's a similar thing. This is a work by Mario Klingemann, and it's called Memories of a Passerby. The work consists of 2 screens that are mounted on the wall, and it's a cabinet with a computer inside it. And that computer generates portraits all the time, continuously, all AI generated in the same way as the portrait of Edmund Bellamy earlier. The fad had sort of died out by this time. This didn't even get the asking price on the auction. So things happen fairly quickly in the AR art world. I do not find either of those particularly interesting, except for them being pioneering artworks. This is a much more interesting use of the same technology to actually tell a story. So this is from my home country, and it's from City Hall in Bergen, which is the second largest town in Norway. And it's called Representation for and by the people who represent them. And it's a jacquard loom woven tapestry with 900 faces on it. None of those people exist. They are all AI-generated portraits trained on a set of 900 photos of actual people from the city of Bergen. And it's there as a memento to the politicians to remember who they are serving. And I think this is a very nice way of using that generative technology in a profound way to actually
Now, my
do
darlings,
something.
AI systems often inherit the bias of the cis-white heteronormative patriarchy that controls our society. But here at the ZZ Show, we plan to disrupt the data set by flooding it with a myriad of marvelous queer drag bodies. So without further ado, that's French, sit back, relax, get your clicking fingers at the ready as we begin the ZZ Show!
Yes, so this is a work by British artist Jake Elves. This is his ZZ Show, which might be the first ever AI-generated drag show, which is interesting, but it's not really what I want to talk to you about right now. I want to talk to you about one of the studies that Jake Elves did for this one, which is this. Because much of the AIs we know are trained on the same data sets. And anyone go to Tessa's talk yesterday? No. Oh, you did. Then you would know that one of the most popular facial recognition data sets is known as Faces in the Wild. And it's very conformative. 4% of all the photos in there are of George W. Bush. And what Jake Elves did was that he took that data set, then he swapped out 1 out of 10 of the photos with photos of drag kings, drag queens, and drag things from the drag community here in London, and then just made these transitions in between the faces. And what he ended up with is this. You get this outer-worldly, very gender-fluid expression, and it is a very nice way to remind us, using art, that we need to think broader than ourselves when we are creating software and creating solutions that use AI, because we have to think about and include everyone. And the data sets that we typically use do not do that. And this is a beautiful thing. Which brings us to the big question. And I promise you that I'm going to take a shot at answering this one, because this is one of the big questions in life. what is art? And I figured I would do that by us together looking at some pictures. Is that all right? So this is obviously from the area or period we are in now, which is platform realism, which is what AI art has been known to become. This is created by Dolly. Everyone can see that. It's basically just me asking ChatGPT to describe this photo to me. And then I took that description, fed it into Dolly, and it produced the photo or image on the left-hand side. The one on the right-hand side, though, is an iconic photo done by Canadian artist Jeff Wall. It's called Mimic. It's from 1981. Displayed in the gallery space, this would be 2 by 2 meters and backlit. So it's monumental. And let's look at what ChatGPT more or less got right. So it has the right amount of people in the scene. It also has the colors more or less there. We have the cityscape and so forth. So more or less visually, the key things there, ChatGPT got right. But there is so much more happening in this photo. So this is some sort of cityscape. Knowing Jeff Wall, we might think that this is in the United States of America, and we have a couple who are about to overtake a man of Asian descent on the street. We also have this slanted eye look on the man in the orange shirt, and his girlfriend, presumably, looks away in disgust. So I see some form of racial tension here. There is something there. And you can also see the Asian man observing this in the side of his eye. But if we look even deeper, you can see that the poses of these people are exactly mirrors of each other. So they're exactly the opposite. And that's no coincidence, because Jeff Wall used the language of cinematography to stage his photos, and he spent an entire day getting the right shot of this one. So it's all meticulously set up. And that goes into the title, Mimic. But you can ask the question about who is mimicking who. One thing which is sure is that Jeff Wall is mimicking Gustave Caillebot's Paris rainy day scene from 100 years earlier. This is more or less the same thing. And this is something that Jeff Wall does in every single one of his photos, is that he references a work from art's history, which is, you sort of have to have seen all of these things to recognize that. But that's one of the things he does. So this is Paris, Haussmannian Paris, with the wide boulevards and a very optimistic view on the future. This is way more bleak. And this is from suburban or outer skirts areas of a city in the United States of America. It's where the weeds grow up through the concrete, and it's where dreams go to die. Because this is much about the American dream failing people. And you have that tension between these people, because in early 1980s, there was a lot of racism in the United States of America. Sadly, there still is. And it's a work about American society not appreciating and respecting the people who helped build the country and helped build the American dream, which now has failed everyone. So all of those things are the things happening underneath the surface here. And once you know that, this photo takes on a whole different meaning. Now, you do not need to know all those things to appreciate this photo, because the image itself is so striking. But when you walk around a gallery space, ask the curators there about the works you see, because there is most often something hidden beneath the surface. And with that, I just want to encourage you to use the tools that are available, because all of the works we have seen today, or most of them at least, have been created using computer code as a means of expression. And you can all sit down and write something just for your own sake. It doesn't need to go into the gallery space. It's fun to be creative. You can even go online and use the AIs, but remember, it's more about the idea and what you want to say with your artwork than what it actually looks like. But promise me one thing, is that you put your heart and soul into it if you do that, because that's what matters in the end. Otherwise, we get something entirely lifeless. So thank you all for coming up. This has been one of the most intimate sessions I've ever done at the NDC. You have been a great crowd. These are some terrible reinterpretations of the artworks you have seen done by ChatGPT and Dolly. If you want to see more things like this, I highly recommend going down to Tate Modern. They have a show on now called Electric Dreams, where many of these artists that you have seen are featured, and you can go to see them in an actual real-life gallery space. So with that, thank you all for coming, and have a great NDC party. Thanks.